If you saw a lifeboat drifting silently in the middle of a fog-covered lake, would you expect to find life inside? That's what stopped Thomas in his tracks that morning, mist curling low on the water, and a shape bobbing in the distance like something lost or forgotten. He had walked this trail every morning for years, ever since his wife passed, but this was the first time something had pulled him so sharply out of his thoughts. The lake was quiet, too quiet. And yet, beneath the whisper of wind and creak of trees, he swore he heard something. A whimper, a cry, almost too soft to be real. But it was there, desperate, hollow, echoing across the glassy surface. Thomas tightened his grip on his thermos and stared at the lifeboat again. Who would leave a boat like that in the middle of nowhere? And why did it sound like it was crying? Thomas Halbert was 72 years old, and every morning he walked the edge of Lake Monroe to remember. He and Ellie had walked it together every day after retirement, hand in hand, their coffee in matching mugs, always laughing at how early they'd become. Then she got sick, fast. Pancreatic cancer gave them 3 months. Now, a year later, he still did the walk. Same coat, same route, but everything else had changed. He barely spoke to his kids anymore. He let the grass grow wild on his property. He avoided the old market where everyone used to know their names. But something about that morning's silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. The lake was holding its breath. The rowboat wasn't supposed to be there. Thomas knew every dock and canoe rental spot along the North Shore, and that old fiberglass lifeboat didn't belong to any of them. It was small enough for maybe 2 people, if they didn't mind getting wet. But it had no oars, no flag, no motor, just drifting, turning slowly, as if the lake itself didn't quite want to let it go. He squinted into the mist, stepping closer to the shore. The crying sound was real now, not his imagination. Sharp, high-pitched, alive, and terrified. He glanced around, not a soul in sight. The ranger station was still closed for the season. Cell service barely existed out here. Whatever was on that boat was alone, utterly alone. Thomas didn't like water, never had. He'd grown up in the desert, learned to drive before he learned to swim. Ellie used to tease him about it, always tried to get him into canoes or kayaks on summer trips. He always refused, citing age or back pain or someone has to take the pictures. She saw through it, of course. He hated the idea of being out on water with nothing solid beneath his feet. But now, as he stared at that boat, he found himself stepping into the boathouse anyway. The old rowboat was still there, dusty but intact. He checked the oars, found a life vest, and dragged it to the water's edge without a second thought. The crying was louder now, urgent, like it knew someone was coming. The fog thickened as Thomas pushed off. Every creak of the oarlocks sent a chill down his spine. The lifeboat was maybe 30 yards out, but each pull felt heavier than the last. Memories pressed in. Ellie in the hospital bed. Her voice gone soft. The way she used to say, "You'll find something to care about again, Tom. I know you will." He'd hated that. He didn't want to care. Caring meant risking more pain. But now here he was, rowing toward a cry in the mist, heartbeat thudding like war drums in his chest. The closer he got, the more he could see the shape inside the boat, small, huddled, shaking. His hands gripped the oars tighter. Please let it be okay, he thought. The smell hit first wet fur, urine, fear. Then the eyes. 2 impossibly wide, glassy eyes, barely visible above the edge of a damp, moldy blanket. A puppy, just a puppy, thin, trembling, maybe 3 months old. Thomas stopped rowing and let the boats drift close. The pup didn't bark, didn't move, just stared at him. Those eyes weren't just scared, they were broken. Thomas reached out, slowly, like approaching a wounded deer. The boat rocked gently. The puppy didn't flinch, but its breathing quickened, shallow and raspy. No collar, no food, nothing but a milk crate, an old towel, and a few torn scraps of what looked like newspaper. Who would do this? Who would row a helpless animal into the middle of a freezing lake and leave it to die in silence? The rage that flared in Thomas's chest surprised him. It felt young, hot, like something he hadn't felt since he was 30. He leaned in, placing one foot carefully into the lifeboat, ignoring the instability beneath him. The pup didn't back away. It was too weak. Its ribs showed through its matted fur. Its paws were raw, as if it had tried to claw its way out at some point. Thomas slid his coat off and wrapped the puppy gently, murmuring words he didn't remember choosing. "You're okay, I've got you, you're not alone now." The journey back felt longer. The oars seemed heavier, the mist thicker. Thomas rowed with the puppy tucked inside his coat, its tiny heart fluttering against his chest like a sparrow's. The cold air bit at his face, but he didn't stop. Every few strokes, he glanced down to make sure the puppy was still breathing. It was, barely, but it was. The shoreline came into view, blurry at first, then sharper. He could see his old truck, the boathouse, the same world he had stepped out of, only now everything looked different. Like someone had nudged the lens of his life just slightly off-center. Once on land, he rushed to his truck, turning the heater on full blast and laying the puppy across the seat with the blanket still wrapped tight. He dug through his glove box for anything useful: an old bottle of water, some jerky, even a granola bar. The pup sniffed the food but didn't eat, too weak. He stroked its head gently, watching it blink slowly. Those eyes so deep, so heavy with something far beyond their months. "Hang in there, little guy," Thomas whispered. "Don't quit on me now." He grabbed his phone. No service, of course. He'd have to drive to the vet himself. Closest one was 30 minutes away. Every second would count. The road out of the woods was rough, full of potholes and blind turns. Thomas drove like a man possessed, one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on the bundle beside him. Every time the pup whimpered, his stomach twisted. He kept whispering to it, nonsense words mostly, just to keep it from slipping away. "We're almost there. Just stay with me." The vet's office appeared like a lighthouse in a storm, a small tin building at the edge of town. He didn't wait for help. He rushed in, cradling the puppy like it was made of glass. "I found him on the lake," he said, breathless. "In a boat, alone. Please do something." The receptionist gasped and called for the techs. Within seconds, the puppy was whisked away, leaving Thomas alone in the waiting room with his hands still trembling. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights. He sat down slowly, coat soaked, hair dripping. His heart was pounding in his ears. He hadn't felt this scared since the night Ellie collapsed in the kitchen. Different fear, same helplessness, the same question buzzing in his mind. What if I'm too late? Time dragged. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the vet came out, young, kind eyes, tired face. "He's alive," she said softly, but it was close. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Alive. That one word felt like a rope pulling him out of deep water. The vet explained the pup's condition: malnourished, hypothermic, dehydration. But he had a fighting chance. He wouldn't have made it another hour out there, she said, almost like an afterthought. Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He'd saved him. But he also felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar, like a door opening just a crack. The vet asked if he wanted to be listed as the pup's emergency contact. "He's yours now, if you want him," she said. Thomas didn't hesitate. "I do." 2 words. That was all it took. He didn't know why they came so quickly, but they did. They'd been waiting in his mouth for years. The vet smiled and went back inside. Thomas sat there alone again, this time with tears in his eyes. Not the heavy grief he'd carried for so long, but something lighter, warmer, hopeful, maybe. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if the pup would ever fully recover. But he knew one thing for certain. That lifeboat hadn't just carried a puppy. It had carried something back to him too, something he thought he'd lost forever. The next morning, he walked the lake trail again, this time slower. His coat zipped high, a soft bundle cradled against his chest. The puppy, still weak, but alert now, looked out with those same wide eyes, taking in the world. They didn't speak, of course, but Thomas swore he could feel something pass between them. A kind of silent agreement. 2 souls adrift, pulled from the edge. Neither of them had chosen to lose everything. But just maybe, they could help each other find a new beginning. The lake was quiet again, but not expectant. Peaceful now, honest, a place for healing. Thomas named him Boy. It came to him that evening as he was cleaning out the old laundry room to set up a sleeping area. Something about the way the pup had floated there in that lifeboat, holding on without knowing why, reminded him of a buoy at sea. A marker, a survivor, a sign of something still anchored, even in the drift. "That's what you are," he said softly, kneeling beside the bundle of blankets. You're a buoy. You stayed afloat. The puppy stirred a little at the sound of his voice, his eyes fluttering open, searching for the warmth again. Thomas reached out and let him rest his tiny head against his hand. It had been years since Thomas had taken care of anything but plants. Even those didn't last long after Ellie passed. He had a tendency to forget to water them, or worse, overwater them trying too hard, too late. But now, Boy demanded something different. Something immediate, the feedings every few hours. The medications the vet had given him, the warmth of body contact, especially at night. The whimpers that came when the room grew too quiet. Thomas hadn't slept through the night in 3 days, but he didn't care. Every time Boo's breathing slowed against his chest, it was like a small heartbeat syncing with his own again. The lake remained a mystery. No one came forward, no missing pet reports. No one saw a thing. The sheriff had taken Thomas's statement, inspected the boat, but it led nowhere. Probably dumped him, he said, not unkindly. Some people don't deserve the air they breathe. Thomas had nodded, unable to speak. The idea haunted him, someone deliberately choosing to leave that puppy in the middle of a lake to die, as if it were just trash. But that rage faded when he looked at Boy, because the story wasn't about the person who left him. It was about what happened after, about what they'd found in each other. At first, Boy wouldn't eat from a bowl. Thomas tried everything: soft food, warm milk, even bits of meat from his own plate. But the puppy would only take food directly from his hand, piece by piece, with long pauses between bites, as if he was waiting for permission. Trust didn't come easy, and Thomas understood that too well. Sometimes, after feeding him, he would just sit there, his hands still outstretched, not ready to move away. "It's okay," he'd whisper, "I'll stay right here." It became a ritual: quiet, patient moments where two souls learned to sit in silence without falling apart. Ellie would have loved him. That thought came one night as Thomas watched Boy twitch in his sleep, paws flicking like he was running through some distant field. Ellie had always said their house needed more life, more noise, more fur, more chaos. She'd wanted a dog for years, but Thomas always said no. Too much work, he'd argued. We're too old. But now, here he was, heating up a rice sock in the microwave to keep a 3-month-old puppy warm. And it didn't feel like work, it felt like purpose. Like maybe there was still something worth getting up for at 6 in the morning. The neighbors started to notice the change. Karen, from 2 doors down, waved at him for the first time in months. "You've got a dog," she called out from her porch. Thomas nodded. Boy nestled in his coat like a baby. "Sort of," he said. "He found me." She smiled, and he realized it had been a long time since someone looked at him with anything other than pity. The mailman left a packet of dog treats in the mailbox. A kid on a bike stopped to ask if he could pet the puppy. Little things, tiny ripples. But for a man who had felt invisible for so long, it was like being seen again. Still, nights were hard. Boy cried in his sleep, sometimes soft, strangled sounds that pulled at Thomas's chest. He recognized it, that sound. He'd made it himself some nights after Ellie died, when the house felt like a tomb and every creak in the walls reminded him of her absence. One night, unable to bear it, he pulled the blanket from the laundry room and carried Boy into his bedroom. Laid him right on the pillow beside him. "I've got you," he whispered into the dark. "You don't have to cry alone." From that night on, neither of them slept apart. A week passed, then another. Boy grew stronger. His legs steadied. His appetite returned. He began to follow Thomas around the house like a shadow, quiet, curious, watching his every move. When Thomas shaved in the bathroom, Boy would sit by the door. When he made breakfast, those tiny eyes peeked around the corner. And when he sat by the fireplace to read, Boy curled up on the rug beside him. It was strange, this feeling of being needed again. It made Thomas nervous, if he was honest. What if he failed? What if he got attached and lost him? But still, he stayed close. They both did. Every morning, they walked, same trail, same lake. But now, there were 2 of them, Boy in a little carrier sling, swaddled like a newborn, his head poking out to sniff the wind. The mist on the lake no longer felt haunted, it felt familiar. Like the beginning of something instead of the end. Thomas talked to him sometimes, just soft mutterings, told him about Ellie, about the garden she used to love, about the songs they danced to in the kitchen. And even though Boy couldn't answer, something in the way he listened made Thomas believe he understood more than most people ever had. Then came the moment that changed everything again. A jogger passed them on the trail, slowed down, turned. "Is that the dog from the lake?" she asked. Thomas stopped, heart quickening. "I think so," he said cautiously. The woman knelt down, her eyes filling. "I saw the boat. I didn't know. I didn't think." She covered her mouth, shaking her head. "I was too scared to go out there." Thomas reached out, placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said quietly. "He made it." She nodded, tears spilling. "Thank you for going," she whispered. "I still hear the crying sometimes." Thomas did too. But now, it ended in silence. Peace. After that, people started stopping him more often. They asked about the rescue. They wanted to know the story. Some brought donations to the vet in Bowie's name. One woman even offered to paint a portrait of the dog in the lifeboat. "It's like something out of a novel," she said. But for Thomas, it wasn't a story. It was real, raw, unfinished, and it was still happening every day in the way Boy curled tighter against him when it rained, or how he whimpered at the sight of deep water. Healing didn't erase the scars, it just gave them a place to rest. It was a Tuesday when Boy collapsed. One moment he was padding along the hallway behind Thomas, wagging his tail, nose to the floor as usual. The next, he stumbled, yelped, and crumpled onto the wooden boards like someone had flipped a switch inside him. Thomas dropped the cup he was holding, coffee exploding across the floor, and rushed to his side. Boy was breathing, but his body was limp, legs twitching slightly, eyes glazed. "No, no, no," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking as he gathered the pup into his arms. The vet's number was on speed dial. He didn't even grab his coat before running to the truck. The emergency vet was 20 minutes away, but Thomas drove like his life depended on it. Every red light was a curse. Every second, he kept glancing at the tiny bundle in the passenger seat. Boy whimpered once, then went quiet again. That silence scared Thomas more than anything. "Stay with me, kid," he muttered. "Don't you dare quit now." When they finally arrived, a tech took Boy straight from his arms. Thomas followed, but a nurse blocked the hallway. "Please wait here," she said firmly. He nodded, breathless. The room spun around him. His hands were shaking. All he could do now was sit and wait. The minutes dragged. Every footstep from the hallway made Thomas sit up. Every time a door opened, he expected bad news. Finally, the vet came out, her expression neutral. "We ran some tests," she said carefully. "It looks like Boy has a neurological disorder, likely a result of trauma or extreme malnutrition during his early development." She paused. "It may cause seizures, sporadic collapses. We'll need to monitor it." Thomas blinked. "But he'll live?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Yes," she said softly, "but it'll take constant care. And there's no guarantee it won't get worse." Thomas nodded. He already knew his answer. The medical bills were rising fast. Between Bowie's recovery from the lake, medications, follow-ups, and now the neurological treatments, Thomas had spent more in 6 weeks than he'd planned to spend in a year. His pension barely covered his expenses. His savings weren't what they used to be. He found himself skipping groceries, reusing old prescriptions, and avoiding calls from the pharmacy. The woman at the front desk offered a payment plan. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. But that's exactly how it felt. Alone. No one else had shown up for that dog. Just him. And he wasn't walking away. Word began to spread in town. Some were kind, people left food on his porch. A local church group brought by a space heater for Bowie's room. But not everyone approved. "You shouldn't be wasting what little you have on a dog with brain problems," muttered one man at the gas station. Another neighbor asked if he'd thought about surrendering the pup to a rescue. "They have resources," she insisted. "It's not giving up. It's doing what's best." Thomas stared at her for a long time. "I did what was best when I got in that boat," he said finally. "And I'm still doing it." His daughter came to visit, the first time in over a year. She stood in the doorway, looking at the house, at the blankets on the floor, the food bowls, the heating pad, and sighed. "Dad, this isn't healthy," she said, not unkindly. "You're old. You're grieving. You're latching onto something that needs more than you can give." He didn't argue. He just walked past her, picked Boy up gently, and held him to his chest. He's not just something, he said. He's someone. His daughter cried, quietly, then hugged them both. But before she left, she looked him in the eye. Promise me if it gets too hard, you'll tell someone. The vet's words haunted him. There's no guarantee it won't get worse. He thought about it constantly. Watched every twitch in Bowie's legs. Listened for every change in his breathing. Some days, the seizures didn't come. Others, they hit like a storm, sudden and brutal. The worst one lasted nearly 2 minutes. Thomas knelt on the floor, whispering, stroking Bowie's fur, helpless. Afterward, the pup curled into a ball and whimpered for hours. That night, Thomas sat by the fire with his old notebook and began writing down every detail. Seizure times, duration, food logs, sleep changes. If we're gonna fight this, he whispered, we'll need a battle plan. One evening, after a particularly bad episode, Thomas sat outside staring at the lake. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, curling over the water like it did that first morning. He thought about the boat, how easily he could have kept walking. How none of this had to happen. He could have ignored the sound, let the lake take the puppy. Saved himself the debt, the worrying, the pain. But when he looked back at the window and saw Bowie's silhouette watching him from the other side of the glass, he knew that pain was better than emptiness. He wasn't just carrying the dog's life anymore. The dog was carrying his. It was during one of those long nights that Thomas made the decision. He wasn't going to surrender Boy. He wasn't going to wait for someone to fix it all. He was going to give everything he had left, time, energy, money, to make sure that little life had a chance. You were thrown away, he whispered, curled beside the sleeping pup. But not by me, not ever by me. That promise became his anchor. His reason, he stopped worrying about what made sense. About what others would think. The decision was made. He would fight. And not just for Boy, but for the part of himself that still believed in second chances. Winter came early that year. The cold settled over Lake Monroe like a heavy curtain, silencing the trees, freezing the trails, and icing over the boat ramp where Thomas had first launched toward that lifeboat. He bundled Boy in sweaters, made little boots from old socks, and covered every draft in the house with towels and plastic. The heating bill tripled. Still, he didn't complain. You and me, he whispered one night, tucking Boy under a blanket. We'll outlast it. But the wind howled louder each evening, and the chill that settled in his joints reminded him he wasn't as strong as he used to be. One morning, he slipped on the ice outside the vet's office while carrying Boy. The puppy was fine, cushioned in his arms, but Thomas hit the pavement hard. Bruised ribs, swollen knee, he refused an ambulance, waved off help, and insisted on keeping his appointment. Later that night, Boy didn't leave his side. He lay across Thomas's chest as if trying to protect him. The pain wasn't just physical. It was a reminder he was running out of strength. And still, every time he looked at that little dog, eyes wide, ears twitching, heart steady, he knew he'd fall 100 more times if it meant keeping him safe. Bills kept coming. The pension barely covered basics now, and Thomas had stopped answering calls from unknown numbers. His daughter mailed him a check once. He sent it back. Pride? Maybe, but mostly, he didn't want to be saved by anyone else. Not when the only thing he wanted to save was already right there in his arms. He started fixing things around the neighborhood for extra cash, tightening porch railings, patching fences, cleaning out gutters. Word spread quickly. The dog man would work cheap. Some gave him extra just to sit on their porch and tell the story. He's not just a dog, Thomas would say. He's the reason I still breathe. One night, Boy had another seizure, worse than any before. His whole body convulsed violently, tiny limbs thrashing as Thomas held him, whispering, weeping, praying. It lasted nearly 3 minutes. When it was over, Boy went limp, eyes rolled back, breath shallow. Thomas thought he was gone. Panic gripped his chest so hard he could barely move. Then one gasp, another. Boy blinked, alive. Barely, but still with him. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat on the floor with the pup in his arms, watching the fire burn down, thinking only one thought: I can't lose him. I've already lost too much. The vet recommended a specialist in the city, 2 hours away. A neurologist for dogs. Expensive, complicated, but promising. They might be able to manage it better, she said. There's a treatment plan. Thomas stared at the pamphlet. Pictures of clean rooms, smiling staff, happy dogs. All of it felt impossibly far from his world. He thanked her, tucked the paper into his coat, and left. That night, he emptied a jar on the kitchen table, coins, bills, old checks, birthday money Ellie had stashed in an envelope years ago. He counted every dollar. It still wasn't enough. But he'd find a way. He had to. He started selling tools, old fishing rods, a vintage radio Ellie had loved, anything he could part with. Each item came with a memory, a sting of loss, but it also bought another week of medication, another tank of gas to the specialist, another test. People asked why he didn't just let go. Because someone already did, he said one day, his voice quiet. And I'm not them. It wasn't about pity, it was about principle. About the belief that no creature, human or animal, should be thrown away. Especially not the ones who've already been hurt the most. The first visit to the specialist changed everything. The clinic was clean, bright, full of energy. Young staff in colorful scrubs, dogs of every shape and size in recovery. The neurologist, Dr. Elena Mason, greeted them with a gentle smile and immediately knelt to Bowie's level. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured, as Boy licked her hand. She ran tests, scans, and assessments while Thomas watched from the corner, heart pounding. After an hour, she looked up. "He's strong," she said. "Damaged, yes, but full of fight. If we're careful, he could have a long life." Thomas almost broke down. Hope, he realized, is heavier than grief. But it carries better. They left the clinic with a plan. New medication, a schedule, regular visits. It would be hard, expensive, but it gave structure to the chaos. And more than anything, it gave Thomas purpose. He pinned the new schedule to the fridge, marked appointments in a calendar Ellie had bought years ago. He made a chart for Bowie's meals and tracked every reaction to the new meds. The work was constant, but it made the long hours feel shorter. It gave shape to the silence. Even the cold felt less cruel now. Because every sunrise meant one more day together. One evening, Thomas took Boy to the lake again, not for the walk, just to sit. The ice had begun to break up, small cracks of water forming like veins across the surface. He sat on the same bench where he'd first heard the crying, holding Boy close in his coat. "You almost didn't make it," he whispered. "Neither did I." The wind blew across the water, sharp and clean. Boy raised his nose, sniffing the air. For the first time, Thomas didn't think of the boat. He thought of the shore. The place they'd made it to. The place they stayed. The decision was final now. There would be no rescue. No surrender. No backup plan. Thomas would see this through to the end, whatever that meant, whatever it cost. Because for the first time in years, his life had a rhythm again. A heartbeat. It woke him in the morning and curled beside him at night. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was part of something again, a bond, a promise, a second chance. And when he looked into Bowie's eyes, he didn't just see the pain. He saw trust that was worth more than all the money in the world. The first real breakthrough came on a Thursday morning, cold and bright, with frost clinging to the porch railings. Boy had been on the new medication for 2 weeks, and so far, no seizures. Thomas barely dared to believe it, but that morning, something changed. While he made breakfast, Boy padded over to the back door, not stumbling, not limping, but walking with intent, and pawed at the wood. Thomas opened it cautiously, expecting hesitation, but Boy stepped outside, nose up, tail wagging slightly. It was the first time since the lake that he'd gone beyond the threshold on his own. Thomas stood there, stunned. Then, quietly, he smiled. They took short walks again. Just around the yard at first, then up the gravel drive, then to the edge of the woods. Bowie's movements were shaky but steady, like a toddler finding his balance. Every few steps he glanced back, making sure Thomas was still there. And Thomas always was. "I'm not going anywhere, Boy," he said softly, again and again. Neighbors began to wave more often. One older couple, the Hendersons, stopped by with a fleece-lined coat for Boy. "He reminds me of a dog I had as a kid," Mr. Henderson said, his voice thick. Thomas nodded. "He reminds me of something too," he whispered. "Something I thought I'd lost." At the next vet visit, the progress was undeniable. Weight gain, muscle tone improving, responsive to sound and movement. Even Dr. Mason looked surprised. "He's coming back," she said, examining Bowie's eyes. Most dogs in his condition don't turn around this quickly. Thomas beamed with quiet pride, but didn't say much. Just scratched Boy behind the ears and murmured, "That's my boy." The clinic staff began referring to Boy as a miracle dog. People asked to meet him in the waiting room. One tech even created a little Bowie's recovery wall with photos, notes, and updates. A community was forming, anchored around one life that had almost been lost. Thomas didn't ask for any of it, but slowly, he found himself saying yes. Yes to people who wanted to hear the story. Yes to the local reporter who showed up on his porch one snowy afternoon. Yes to the retired teacher who invited him and Boy to speak at her reading group. "It's not just about the dog," she told him. "It's about what people throw away, and what they don't expect to be found." Thomas hadn't thought of it that way before. He still didn't see himself as a hero, just a man who couldn't ignore a sound in the mist. But if sharing it helped others listen for the quiet cries too, then maybe it mattered. Word spread. A radio station picked up the story, then a local TV crew. Thomas hated cameras, but Boy didn't seem to mind. He sat calmly on Thomas's lap during interviews, tail wagging, licking the microphone once, which made everyone laugh. The reporter leaned in and said, "So what made you go out on that lake?" Thomas paused, thinking. Then he answered, slowly, "I think I'd gotten used to silence. But that morning, I heard something, and I couldn't ignore it. I guess I didn't want to stay numb anymore." The room went quiet. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't mind being seen. The city vet clinic offered to sponsor Bowie's medication. "We've had donations," Dr. Mason explained. People moved by his story. Thomas tried to decline, but she shook her head. "You've done more than enough, let us help now." It felt strange accepting kindness. But this time, he said yes. And it changed something. Bowie's care became a community project. The feed store gave discounts. The town's middle school raised funds for a new dog bed. People mailed letters. Some came with photos of their own rescue animals. Others were handwritten notes. "You reminded me to try again," one said. Thomas read every single one. With the money he didn't have to spend on medication, Thomas started rebuilding things. He fixed the sagging fence, painted the old shed out back, even repaired the porch swing Ellie had loved. Boy followed him everywhere, curious and clumsy, like a small apprentice. One day, Thomas stood back, looked at the house, and realized something strange. It felt like a home again. Not just a place he survived in, but a place he belonged to, a place worth caring for. Ellie's wind chimes still hung by the kitchen window. When they rang now, it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like welcome. Boy began responding to commands. "Sit. Stay. Come." His tail wagged more often. He barked for the first time, loud and sudden, at a squirrel, which made Thomas laugh so hard he dropped his rake. They played for the first time too. A ball, half chewed, tossed across the yard. Boy didn't always chase it, but when he did, it felt like magic. A tiny creature, once left for dead, now bounding through dry leaves like he owned the world. Thomas watched, amazed. The laughter felt unfamiliar, rusty almost, but real. He hadn't heard himself laugh like that in over a year. Bowie's eyes changed too. They were still wide, still searching, but they no longer looked haunted. They were present, curious, playful. Sometimes they followed Thomas so intently it felt like he was being studied. Boy was learning him in the same way Thomas had learned the dog's patterns and fears. It was a relationship, not a rescue. Two-way. Honest. Some nights, Thomas would lie on the rug beside him, just watching him sleep. He still had nightmares sometimes, but not as often. "And not alone. We're doing okay, aren't we?" Thomas would whisper, and even without words, Boy always seemed to answer. Then came the letter from the mayor's office. A formal invitation. The town was hosting a community event, and they wanted to honor Boy and Thomas for their story. Thomas was hesitant at first. Crowds weren't his thing, but the vet encouraged him. "You've done something remarkable," she said. "Let people thank you." On the day of the event, hundreds came. Children lined up to pet Boy. People brought framed pictures, flowers, hand-knit blankets. The mayor gave a short speech, then handed Thomas a plaque. "For compassion in action," it read. Thomas stood at the podium, Boy in his arms, and said simply, "He saved me too." The recognition from the mayor brought more attention than Thomas expected. A reporter from a regional news network came to film a feature. Then, unexpectedly, an email arrived from a rescue foundation in another state. They'd seen the story, they wrote, and wanted to ask if Thomas and Boy would consider becoming ambassadors for compassion, a kind of traveling presence at shelters and adoption events. Thomas stared at the screen for a long time. Him? A retired widower who'd barely left his hometown in years. But Boy nudged his leg, tail tapping the floor like a quiet metronome. Maybe it wasn't such a strange idea after all. Their first visit was local. A shelter on the outskirts of town, the kind of place Thomas used to drive past without noticing. Now, he stepped through the front door with Boy tucked under his arm, feeling the weight of nervous eyes on him. A young boy knelt beside Boy and asked softly, "Is he the one from the boat?" Thomas nodded. The boy didn't speak again, just rested his hand gently on Bowie's head. Later, one of the volunteers told Thomas the boy hadn't spoken since losing his own dog in a fire. That afternoon, he whispered 2 words to his mom, "I want another." Thomas blinked back tears. They began visiting more shelters, some nearby, some farther. Boy, calm and gentle, seemed to sense the energy of each place, nervous animals, tired staff, hopeful adopters. He moved quietly, patiently, as if offering silent proof that healing was possible. Thomas watched it happen again and again, a child sitting cross-legged beside Boy, a woman crying softly as she touched his fur, a couple deciding to bring home a shy senior dog after hearing the story. Thomas didn't preach. He didn't try to inspire. He just told the truth. "We found each other when we needed it most," he'd say. And we kept going. The community began treating Thomas differently too. Not just as the man who saved a dog, but as someone who had survived something himself. People invited him to speak at events. Churches asked him to light candles during remembrance services. A veterans group reached out, asking if he'd talk about loneliness and purpose. "I'm not an expert," he'd always say, but they didn't want an expert. They wanted a man who'd walked through grief and still found something worth loving. They wanted the story of the boat, of the cry in the fog, of the decision to row out when it would have been easier to walk away. One evening, after a long day at a shelter across the state line, Thomas sat at a diner booth with Boy curled beside him. The waitress poured him a coffee, smiled, and said, "You're the dog man, right?" He laughed. "I guess I am." She pointed to a young man in the corner, earbuds in, hoodie up, eyes hollow. "That's my nephew," she said quietly. "Hasn't left his room in months. But he begged to come here when he heard you'd be in town." Thomas looked over. The boy met his eyes briefly, then looked away. Thomas nodded. Later, as he and Boy walked past, he gently handed the boy a folded card. "For when you're ready," he said. It just had one line. "Keep rowing. Back home, things changed too." Thomas started receiving letters from all over the country. Veterans, widows, foster kids. People who felt forgotten. People who'd once given up. "Your story reminded me to go back for my brother," one woman wrote. "I went out on the lake too," another man said, "but I didn't find a dog. I found myself." Thomas saved every note, pinned them on the wall. He didn't feel alone anymore, not really. Grief still lived with him, but it had changed form. It no longer blocked the light, it cast long shadows that made the brightness stand out even more. Boy had become more than a companion. He was a compass, a reminder. On hard days, and there were still hard days, Thomas would sit beside him, press his hand into that warm patch of fur, and remember who he was now. Not just a widower, not just a man in recovery, but someone who had answered a cry, and someone who had stayed. Boy had his own fears still. Sudden noises made him tremble. Deep water triggered panic. But every time he looked at Thomas, he calmed. And every time Thomas saw him sleep without shaking, it felt like victory. One stormy night, lightning cracked so loudly that Boy dove under the bed, trembling. Thomas got down on the floor, crawling under beside him. They stayed like that for an hour, pressed together, neither of them speaking, just breathing through the fear. It reminded Thomas of a hospital room, long ago, when Ellie had gripped his hand during one of her final lucid moments. "Don't leave me," she'd whispered. "Never," he had said. And he hadn't. He'd stayed with her until the very last moment, just like he was staying with Boy now. Through the tremors, through the storms, through every shadow that dared return. The town made it official a few weeks later. Boy Day, March 12th, the anniversary of the rescue. A small festival was planned. Food trucks, shelter booths, free adoptions. And at the center, Thomas and Boy seated under a tent, surrounded by photos of their journey. A group of school children sang a song they'd written, "Sometimes Love Comes from the Middle of the Lake." Thomas cried, openly, proudly. No one laughed. No one looked away. When he lifted Boy into his lap, the dog licked his cheek and leaned in, as if to say, "See, you stayed." And now, look. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the festival lights flickered on, Thomas sat beside the lake again, the same bench, the same view. Only this time, there was no fog, no silence. Just color, warmth, and the hum of people gathering behind him. Boy rested his chin on Thomas's knee, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. Thomas ran a hand over his head and whispered, "We made it, kid." For a long while, they didn't move, didn't speak. Just sat there, two survivors, no longer drifting, no longer alone, quietly witnessing the beauty of everything that had come after the pain. The days after Boy Day felt like a dream, quiet but full of meaning. Strangers waved at Thomas on the street now. Letters kept coming. People sent collars, treats, toys, even paintings. One woman from Vermont sent a handmade quilt with Bowie's face stitched into the center. "He reminds me of my husband," the note read. Both survivors. Both quiet warriors. Thomas hung the quilt in the hallway, just across from Ellie's favorite photo, her laughing in a field of sunflowers. The house was full again, not of noise, but of life. Not of echoes, but of presence. It was the kind of peace that grows from shared pain. Mornings became sacred. The routine of feeding, walking, checking meds, and brushing Bowie's coat brought a rhythm Thomas hadn't known he craved. It gave the passing hours shape, structure. On colder mornings, he'd wrap Boy in his old army blanket, and they'd sit on the porch watching the world wake up together. Boy leaned into him now, fully, completely. There was no more flinching, no more wide-eyed fear. His trust was total. One morning, as snow began to fall in thick, silent flakes, Thomas whispered, "You healed faster than I did," and in that moment, he realized it was true. The town council invited Thomas to join a new committee, one focused on outreach and animal welfare. At first he hesitated. "I'm just an old man with a dog," he said. But the mayor smiled and shook her head. "You're the reason that outreach matters," so he said yes. The meetings weren't fancy, just a few people with good hearts around a folding table in the library's back room. They started a new initiative, Second Chances, pairing senior citizens with rescue animals in need of calm homes. The idea took off. Within months, dozens of matches had been made. A local news headline read, "Bowie's legacy grows." Thomas visited each of the new adopters personally. He sat in quiet kitchens and listened to people who'd once felt invisible describe how a pair of eyes, often tired, sometimes blind, always hopeful, had given them reason to wake up again. "It's like he knew I needed him," one man said, stroking an old mutt's back. Another woman clutched a tiny one-eyed cat to her chest. "I haven't laughed this much since '92, she whispered. Thomas nodded. He knew exactly what they meant. Because healing doesn't shout. It arrives in moments, in meals shared, in quiet rooms filled with second chances. Even Boy had changed. He no longer trembled during storms. He learned to swim, slowly, cautiously, with Thomas waiting beside him in a shallow creek near the woods. It took weeks. At first, just a paw in the water. Then two, then a step. Thomas never pushed, just waited. And one warm afternoon, Boy walked in, chest deep, turned, and barked once. A real bark, proud, certain. It echoed through the trees, and Thomas laughed until his sides hurt. He waded into, shoes and all, and they stood there, man and dog, chest deep in clear water, feeling more alive than either had in years. One afternoon, Thomas took out the old rowboat again. He hadn't touched it since that day on the lake. It still smelled like damp leaves and memories. But he cleaned it up, patched a leak, sanded the oars. Then, gently, he lifted Boy into the boat and pushed off. The water was calm, the sky a soft gray. They didn't go far, just to the spot where it all began. The middle of the lake, the place of the cry. Thomas looked around, letting the silence settle over him, and whispered, "This is where you were thrown away. Then he looked at Boy, curled at his feet, and added, "And this is where I started over." He didn't row back right away. He let the boat drift for a while, the gentle lap of the water lulling them both into stillness. Thomas thought of Ellie. Of all the mornings they'd walked this shore. Of the silence that followed her loss. He hadn't cried for her in months. But that day, on the water, with Bowie's steady breath beside him, the tears came. Not heavy, not hopeless, just honest. "I miss you," he said aloud. "But I'm okay now." The wind picked up slightly, brushing across his face like a whisper. And he smiled, because maybe she already knew. That night, Thomas wrote a letter to himself, to Boy, to the world. He wrote about the day on the lake, about the decision to row. He wrote about grief, about silence, about what it means to hear something crying and actually go toward it. Sometimes, he wrote, the thing you save is the thing that saves you right back. He sealed it in an envelope and tucked it into a book on the shelf, a small message for someone to find later. Maybe his daughter, maybe a stranger. Maybe Boy, if dogs could read. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was written. In the months that followed, life settled into something beautiful. Not loud or exciting, just steady. Thomas no longer marked his days by absence. He marked them by meals shared, walks taken, moments of stillness beside the fire. Boy slept more now, stretched long across the foot of the bed like he belonged there. And he did. He no longer startled at shadows. His eyes were bright. He barked when the doorbell rang. He had toys now, some chewed to bits, others he guarded fiercely like treasures. And Thomas had photos, dozens, a wall full of memories that hadn't existed a year ago. People still stopped them on walks, some just nodded in recognition. Others came closer, asked how Boy was doing. Some shared their own stories, rescues, recoveries, regrets. Thomas always listened. Sometimes he offered advice. Most times, he simply nodded and said, "I know," because he did. He understood what it meant to find something worth holding on to. What it meant to show up, again and again, even when you had every reason to give up. Boy, walking ahead with that slightly uneven gait, had become a kind of symbol in the town. Not for perfection, but for perseverance. His daughter began visiting more often. She brought muffins, new blankets, even a leash with Bowie's name stitched into it. She stayed longer each time. They cooked together again, laughed, grieved quietly. One day, she said, "You're different, Dad, lighter." He smiled. "He brought me back," he said, nodding toward Boy. Then, after a pause, "And you too." She wiped her eyes. They didn't talk about the years that passed in silence. They didn't need to. Some things don't need fixing, just feeling. And sitting side by side on the porch, all that mattered was the warmth between them. Children from the school started sending drawings, crayon portraits of Boy in superhero capes, standing on boats, smiling beside stick-figure versions of Thomas. The library added a children's story time called Bowie's Corner, where kids learned about empathy and kindness. Thomas attended the first one, sat in the back, watching their wide eyes and eager hands. One little girl raised hers and asked, why didn't he just walk away? The librarian paused, then turned to Thomas. He stood up slowly, cleared his throat, and said, because sometimes, when you hear someone crying, you don't get to walk away. Not if you still have a heart. At home, Boy began showing signs of age, slower movements, more naps, a little stiffness in the mornings. But his spirit never dulled. He still greeted Thomas every morning with a tail thump and soft whimper. He still chased birds, clumsily. Still curled beside the fire, nose tucked under his paw. Thomas knew time was moving. He saw it in the mirror too, deeper lines, slower steps. But now, it didn't feel like something to fear. Time had become a gift. One more walk, one more sunrise, one more belly rub. Each day was a chapter he never expected to write, and that made every line precious. The vet called one day, offering to frame Bowie's original x-rays. They're a reminder, she said, of how far he's come. Thomas agreed. He hung them in the hallway, right beside a photo from the adoption festival. Boy in his red scarf, eyes bright, tail mid-wag. Guests would pause, look between the images, and ask, is that really the same dog? Thomas would nod. It is. And I wasn't the same man, either. Sometimes, Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about witnessing it fully, then choosing to walk forward anyway, even with the limp, even with the scar. On a warm spring afternoon, Thomas hosted a gathering in his backyard. Just a few chairs, some lemonade, and people whose lives had been touched by the journey. The Hendersons brought cookies. The mailman stopped by with his kids. Even the sheriff came. Everyone took turns patting Boy, who moved from lap to lap like a celebrity. Someone played a guitar, someone else read a poem. At sunset, Thomas stood and raised a glass. To second chances, he said, to not giving up, and to listening, especially when the world gets quiet. The group echoed his words. No one said more. They didn't need to. That night, Thomas sat by the fireplace with Boy nestled beside him, snoring softly. The house was warm. Outside, the trees rustled in the breeze. He reached for his notebook, the one he'd started on the night of Bowie's worst seizure, and flipped through it slowly. Dates, notes, medications, then sketches, lyrics, journal entries. It had become more than a record. It was a story, one he planned to leave behind someday. For his daughter. For anyone who ever needed proof that love can still find you, even when you've given up looking. Especially then, he didn't know how long they had left. A year, a season, a day, but it didn't scare him anymore. Because the fear had been replaced with gratitude, Boy had taught him that. Taught him to live fully, gently, and presently, to choose compassion over convenience. To row toward the cry, even when the water was cold, especially then. And every night, before turning off the lamp, Thomas would whisper the same words. You're safe, little one. I've got you. And Boy, already half asleep, would give a little sigh, content, anchored, home. One morning, the bench by the lake had a small plaque added to it. No fanfare, just quiet installation by a parks volunteer. It read, to the man who rowed toward the cry, and the dog who waited. No names, just truth. People stopped there often now. Some left flowers, others sat in silence. Some even heard echoes in the fog. No longer a place of sadness, but one of peace. A place that whispered, not all who are lost stay that way. Some are found, some are saved, and some save others.